Move, I'm gay.
Up in the sky, it's a bird!
It's a plane!
No, it's queer representation in American mainstream comics. Queer is an umbrella term that refers to people who are not heterosexual or not cisgender, with the original meaning referring to something seen as strange or peculiar. Superheroes are mostly known as benevolent fictional characters with superpowers. They have played a major role in American society for several decades, being the first option for a child's Halloween costume or the basis for a huge financial success. The existence of superheroes in comics dates back to 1936, with Superman being the first widely successful costume crusader. Superman served as a perfect portrayal of an American citizen at the time, and an allegory for the best American society had to offer. I mean, he's literally the most powerful being on Earth and capable of insane acts of destruction. But instead, he lives as a beacon for truth and justice because he was raised with substantial American values by his modest farmer parents from Kansas. Superman possessing super speed, super strength, flight, and the ability to shoot laser beams from his eyes pale in comparison to his privileges of being a white, conventionally attractive, heterosexual, cisgender, middle-class man in the USA. I mean, who even needs superpowers at that point? Despite initial success, superhero comic sales fell in a sharp decline until the fear of the rise of communism through the Red Scare of the 1950s began to run rampant. Comic books began to be used as a way to establish the close relationship between superheroism and the patriotic duty to protect traditional American values. To ensure the prolongment of this relationship, the Comics Code Authority was formed to prevent comic books from influencing the youth in negative ways. The creation of the CCA can largely be attributed to protests, book burnings, and studies led by Dr. Frederick Wortham. In his book, Seduction of the Innocent, he discusses the way that comic books preyed on the youth and led them down paths of violence and sexual perversion. However, many of his findings and testimonies were found to be falsified. What a shocker. The Comics Code Authority was formed in September of 1954 by the Comics and Magazine Association of America. The program is modeled after the Hays Code, which was a self-imposed industry set of guidelines for motion pictures released between 1934 and 1968 that prohibited profanity, suggestive nudity, graphic violence, racial mixing, and rape from being shown on screen. Much like the Hays Code, the CCA was not regulated by the government. However, there was a fear distributing a comic book that was deemed unsafe and led to a lack of support and financial success. For a different context, it's the same way an unrated movie sees little to no support from big movie theaters. The CCA banned supernatural beings, drugs, and crime from being shown, in addition to regulating how officers and government officials were portrayed in comics. Illicit sexual relations were never portrayed in comic books, and love stories heavily placed emphasis on the value of home and the sanctity of marriage. There was also a strict adherence to anything deemed sexually perverse, aka queer. And these guidelines were determined on a case-by-case basis, preventing comic book authors from establishing sort of precedents for the way that characters are meant to be portrayed. Because of the strict prohibitions, the storyline of Catwoman and Batman being in a relationship was restricted simply because Catwoman was a criminal and Batman was a hero. Now imagine how much more difficult it would be to get that storyline CCA approved if Catwoman was Catman. It was not until 1971 that the codes began to loosen, leading to the inclusion of queer-coded closeted heroes like Northstar in the comic books. In fact, it was strictly forbidden to mention the word gay in the CCA-approved the comics until 1989. Fun fact, this was the same year that Denmark allowed for same-sex partnerships that mirrored marriage rights for queer couples. Just goes to show how behind the times the CCA was and how much homophobia was ingrained in American entertainment. Obviously, queerness could not have been explicit to viewers, but creators found ways to include little gay Easter eggs. The only way that LGBT characters and storylines could be introduced during this time was through innuendo, subtext, and inference, thanks to the CCA. Wonder Woman, also known as Princess Diana, is a DC Comics superheroine and founding member of the Justice League who first appeared in All-Star Comics number 8 on October 21st, 1941. Wonder Woman has been largely regarded as a feminist icon that connected the first and second waves of modern feminism, but also has increasingly queer subtext surrounding her. Diana hails from Themyscira, an all-female Amazonian paradise island. By definition, a paradise is a place where one is meant to live happily and peacefully. A substantial part of happiness stems from the ability to have a fulfilling sexual or romantic partnership. Being from an island with only women, it is not out of the question to suggest that Wonder Woman may have had lesbian interactions during her time on Themyscira. And with a large part of Wonder Woman's imagery being related to bondage as an allegory for the oppression of women, you ever wondered why she used a lasso as a weapon of choice? She's subverting gender roles by being the one who restricts and constrains. Hashtag mind blown. Her silver arm cuffs are even called the bracelets of submission. So there is plenty of social commentary to go around. Because she spends her time tying up others, she represents the potential of a woman not tied down by marriage, homemaking, motherhood, and heteronormativity. A major component in the censorship of queer stories is queer erasure. Queer erasure is the deliberate act of removing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, asexual, and queer groups or people from record, or to dismiss or downplay their significance. Static Shock is a series that suffered greatly from the queer erasure of an essential character. Premiering in September of 2000 on the Kids WD programming block, Static Shock follows the superhero adventures of Virgil Hawkins and his friend Richie, aka Year. In the comics, Richie is canonically queer, coming out as gay in Static number 16. But his sexuality was altered in the cartoon adaptation due to censors from the broadcasting channel. In fact, the writer of the show, Dwayne McDuffie, fought to have Richie's queerness included in scenes, but was shot down continuously. However, McDuffie found ways to incorporate hints towards Richie's queer fondness. In many scenes, Richie can be seen catcalling women in an effort to prove his straightness, with Virgil meeting his obvious attempts at selling himself straight with eye rolls and sighs because he knew his truth. McDuffie further explores with the quote, "It'll never come up in the show because it's Y7, but as far as I'm concerned, Richie is gay. The way I dealt with Richie's homosexuality was to write him aggressively and unconvincingly announcing his heterosexuality whenever possible. Wow, look at those girls in the swimsuits. I sure like girls." While Virgil rolled his eyes at the transparency of it. The idea that Richie's queerness was suppressed to be palatable for a younger audience is a moot point because numerous cartoons at the time featured heterosexual relationships, such as Ed, Ed, and Eddie, which showcased a group of sisters whose main objective in the show was to trap the main trio in efforts to make out with them against their own will. I don't know about you, but I'd rather my child watch a gay superhero instead of a triad of predatory female stalkers with an affinity for molestation. I don't know, that's just me though. As more LGBTQ activist groups demanded the incorporation of queer storylines in media, in addition to the societal advancement of LGBTQ visibility, we began to see the inclusion of more queer superheroes and subplots. One of the first depictions of the queer lifestyle in comic books comes from Captain America number 268, which was released in April of 1982. The story follows Arnie Roth, a childhood friend of Captain America who never married because relationships never seemed right for him. But he was able to find happiness in the company of Michael Bleck, his best friend and roommate. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Arnie and Michael then share an emotional embrace, causing Cap to realize they're actually queer. Instead of taking a moment to embark into the casual homophobia of the 80s, Captain begins to think about the importance of love, despite whatever fears you have. He then remarks how lucky Arnie is to have found Michael, being one of the first innuendo queer couples in mainstream comics. These few panels do a great job of reinforcing the main retort towards generalized homophobia. Love is love. Although they never come out directly and say, "We're gay," it is incredibly easy to infer that these two young men are in a gay relationship, and not merely roommates.
And they were roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Another smaller example of thinly veiled homosexuality in comics is found in the introduction of Maggie Sawyer. Debuting in Superman number 4 in 1987, Sawyer was revealed to live with a woman and later admitted that she spent years trying to deny feelings a Catholic girl didn't want to consider. This is an obvious allusion for a coming out story. Eventually joining a prominent trio of DC comic lesbians, including Batwoman and Renee Montoya, Maggie serves as DC's introduction into the world of lesbianism, shattering barriers for the comic publishing team. On the discussion of queer superheroes, we would be absolutely remiss to not discuss the first openly gay superhero, Northstar. Debuting in April of 1979, Northstar, also known as Jean Paul Bobet, is considered the pioneer of queer representation in superhero squads. He came to fruition after X-Men artist and writer John Byrne said, "There needs to be gays in comics because there are gays in real life. The population of the fictional world should represent the real world." Northstar is said to be gay from his conception, but his queerness is not hinted at until years into his inclusion of the action-filled Marvel comic book pages. In Alpha Flight number 7 of 1983, Northstar is reunited with an old friend, Raymond, who is hinted to be an old lover. Then in Alpha Flight number 106 of 1992, Northstar finally comes out and declares his queerness after finding an abandoned child with AIDS. This was a relation to the real-life HIV/AIDS epidemic occurring at the time, which some may find a bit stereotypical nowadays, but it was incredibly empowering at the time due to the sheer amount of queer lives lost to the virus. There's a beautiful irony in queer identities being formed and strengthened through the decimation of queer livelihood. From that point on, Northstar became known as one of the greatest examples of what a queer hero could look like and do. He eventually married his husband, Kyle Janadu, in Astonishing X-Men number 51 in 2012, becoming the first depiction of a same-sex wedding in mainstream comics. Queer identities are not reserved for minor heroes or side characters, as many would like to believe. There are a multitude of powerful superheroes who are openly LGBTQ+. A notably gay superhero is Iceman. His sexuality as a gay man was revealed in November of 2015 on the pages of Uncanny X-Men number 600. Being an Omega-level mutant, Iceman is one of Marvel's most respected and powerful mutants. This high-profile and iconic hero being a part of the LGBTQ community reflects Marvel's commitment to have their comics reflect real life. His coming-out story focuses on the fear of rejection and intersectional ideologies. The entire story of the X-Men series serves as an allegory for the civil rights movement, with every member of the X-Men sharing a single strangeness that makes them a target and alienates them from society. Iceman, being a mutant and being gay, two interlocking oppressions, chose to conceal his sexuality from the world and his teammates in hopes of not being persecuted and judged for another part of his life that he has no control over. Despite being a prominent part of the X-Men since the first released comic issue, Iceman's sudden queerness was handled with relative ease. The author made his revelation somewhat minuscule, highlighting how the world has become more tolerant of one another, allowing for LGBTQ individuals to live freer than ever imagined. Queer representation is overall seen as a positive thing, but there has been criticism surrounding the portrayal of certain queer superheroes in LGBTQ issues. Comics have a very bad habit of portraying characters from faraway planets or those with shape-shifting abilities as the only people capable of sexual and gendered fluidity. Nearly every bisexual, intersex, and transgender character in mainstream superhero comics check the box of being an alien, inhabitant of a parallel Earth, shapeshifter, or all of the above, as if a science fiction upbringing or alternative biology is needed to explain and understand them, especially when we're discussing stories that already easily accept things such as heat vision, telepathy, and living computers. One pressing topic is the over-sexualization of queer female characters like Harley Quinn. Debuting in the Batman cartoon series and being adopted into the comics, Harley has been somewhat synonymous with the DC comics in recent years due to her popularity. When asked to describe Harley Quinn, most would mention her curvaceous body, romantic relationship with the Joker, or even how they aspire to be like her or with her. Not many fans will mention how Harley holds a PhD in psychiatry, has Olympic-level gymnastics training, or that she shines most when with her long-term girlfriend, Poison Ivy. Going back to her origins in the 90s animated Batman series, Harley Quinn's character was used to serve as a tragic portrayal of being trapped in an abusive relationship. Harley was a psychiatrist who was assigned to treat the Joker. He then manipulated her, twisting her into loving him and serving as one of his henchmen. Since then, she has been reduced to the crazy and promiscuous blonde chick in a toxic relationship with the Joker. Harley's intelligence, athleticism, and queerness has been put on the back burner to support a heteronormative narrative. Her relationship with Ivy in particular is where most of her growth took place, yet it is not free from critique either. The couple's breakup has been criticized for being a stereotypical portrayal of queer romances where everything ends poorly. Positive representation of same-sex relationships throughout mainstream comics has been seldomly written in comparison to straight relationships, like those of Clark Kent and Lois Lane, or Barry Allen and Iris West. The iconic comic book couple of Harley and Ivy filled that desire for a great number of readers. Queer representation in superhero-centric American mainstream comics like DC and Marvel has been the stomping grounds for many conversations surrounding censorship, inclusion, and criticism. These portrayals of queer stories have become a part of pop culture, shaping the way that members of the LGBTQ+ community are approached by general society. It is pertinent that these conversations persist as more and more people align themselves with queer identities. The people with the courage to live fearlessly are the real superheroes of the world.